emancipation. And I lived in Turkey for many years, and I met so many wonderful people, kindness beyond belief, who were fully convinced that the Armenian genocide never happened and had an answer for every objection. And I didn't even bother trying because, well, what was the point? And not to excuse anything, of course, but it's more complicated than I think we would like it to be. And could you describe the process of putting this all together? So you first encountered sources at the German Federal Archives, and then you went to other archives, and you even found sources directly from your grandparents. Could you describe that process?
When I went to the German Federal Archives, I was informed that they had about roughly 100 pages about my grandparents. And of course, I was stunned because you can't expect to find that sort of information because the Nazis were extremely good at destroying their own documentation. But what I was eventually presented with were documents that pertain to their applications to join the SS as a married couple. So the objective of those applications was to demonstrate racial purity. So the SS were regarded as the elite and the future elite and the ones who would spearhead the new society. And they were expected to give birth to a lot of children and, build up the strength of the nation in that way as the Nazis saw it. And so their applications had family trees going back to 1800 and photographs taken of them from all angles to show that they were, had the right shaped heads and looked like the right sort. Also contained my grandfather's party card, which showed all of the places where he had served in occupied Poland, which is, of course, quite helpful because that gave me some idea of where I needed to go next. But I would say the hardest part of that documentation for me to look at and swallow was actually the sight of my grandmother's handwriting, because I had received so many birthday cards and loving letters from her over the years, and she had filled in a lot of forms and written up a description of her life up to that point, which she was required to do as part of the application. And for me to see her handwriting there and to recognize it was so bewildering, so disorienting, and also was, all the time in my mind I was thinking, well, perhaps it isn't them. My tendency was to try to be in denial, but when I saw her handwriting, I realized that there was no denying that these were their documents. So with that initial information, I consulted with some academics who told me that I really needed to get to the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland, and particularly their branch in Poznan. But in order to apply to receive whatever documents they had about my grandfather, I actually had to get a hold of his death certificate. So I had to demonstrate that he was dead. And the problem was that his death certificate was buried somewhere in some archive out in Brazil, because he had died in Brazil in 1976. And I don't know if you know anything about the Brazilian archives, but they're not very well organized.
I've been in some disorganized archives, so I can sympathize.
Extremely difficult to find anything like that. And actually, in the end, we found, so I managed through a U.S. professor who put me in touch with a graduate student of hers who was based in Brazil, to find this birth certificate buried in a town, town files or public files of a town on the border between Paraguay and Brazil. So it really was incredible that this student managed to find this document. And with that, I could apply for the documents in Poland, and was presented with in Poznan with a wad of documents which confirmed that my grandfather's extradition had been sought by the Poles. by a local Polish government, and that they were eyewitness accounts by Poles who had worked on his estates, and these accounts were recorded in 1946. And they were pretty detailed, and I couldn't read them at first because they were in Polish, so some Polish friends of mine translated them eventually. But the names of families who had recorded these accounts were there, and so I thought I must go and find them. And fortunately, the young Polish archivist who had been put in charge of giving me these documents decided that this was a 1 in a million chance to go and research what he called the real history. So he made himself available at no cost, privately, of course. This wasn't through the archives. He just decided this was a really worthy project, and accompanied me through the countryside trying to find people. And actually, on different visits that I made to Poland, we found 5 different families, and were able to speak to people who remembered my grandfather very well. In fact, some of them remembered both of my grandparents very well, and painted a fairly consistent picture of an ideologically fanatic SS man. It was a very demoralizing time, I must say, to listen to those accounts, but I think quite necessary to listen to them. And I also, in between the trips to Poland, did some trips to northern Germany, to the towns west of Hamburg, where they had lived before the war and to which they returned after the war. And that was a very eerie experience too, because I assumed that Germans who have done probably more than any other people in the world to try to come to terms with this past, were at a family and community level were quite sheepish about talking about this period of history and about specific persons. And so I found myself being handed accounts in little brown paper envelopes, and people whispering around me, some people turning me away, and sometimes would find that in the annals of these various towns, this particular, the whole period of the Third Reich just simply wasn't covered. It was just a black hole in the annals of some of these towns. So that was an odd experience. And eventually in 2014, I thought that, my resources had run out because I had financed all this myself. But I knew I needed to get to Latin America so that I could research how my grandparents got there and what their lives looked like there. Just as I was running out, my alma mater, Wellesley College, stepped in with a fellowship, and a very substantial fellowship, which made it possible for me to travel to Brazil and, as it turns out, to Paraguay, where I discovered a branch of the family I hadn't known about before. It was actually my uncle who remembered the occupation, was able to tell me something about his experience of that. And in Brazil, I went to archives in São Paulo and Rio and Campo Grande in the interior, and also managed to travel into the interior and find at least the first place where my grandfather had settled after he'd fled to Brazil. So that's a rough look at that's a rough outline of what it looked like.
Right. A couple of questions. First of all, you were given information in the brown envelopes. What sort of information did you receive? And also, you said that people had vivid memories of your grandfather, that he said he was very committed National Socialist, but you also wrote that they thought he was a good farmer. So what was that about?
We'll start with the brown paper envelopes. Well, at some point, the mayor of one of the towns where my grandfather had settled after the war tried to gather together information from the town citizens about my grandfather. And so there were accounts really of his behavior after the war, which characterized him as being a former member of the SS elite who had, he purchased a hunting house after the war and turned it into a hotel. And so the townspeople said that, former SS would descend on this place on designated hunting weekends, and they would mingle with one another and discuss old times and generally hang together, because you have to remember that after the war, in the new democracy, I mean, they had for nearly, throughout the duration of the Reich, most of them been the elite. They were used to being on top, and now all of a sudden they weren't. And in fact, the very qualities, the very roles and ranks that had put them on top of the society now had to be hidden. And so, of course, for them, it was kind of a boost to get together on these weekends, and also they helped each other practically as well. So I mentioned that one of the people who came to my grandparents' hunting hotel and visited was actually the former SS who was their link in Brazil and helped them to find a place to go. The other things in those brown envelopes, it was really painting a picture of somebody who had been damaged by the war. He had been stationed in, as I said, in one of the most violent theaters of that war, and he was very affected by that. So, it's somebody who always slept with his revolver next to him, who once, shot at somebody who was trespassing over his property, and who generally had an extremely volatile temper. So really painting a picture of somebody who was both, who had both been ruined by the war, whose personality had been really destroyed by all the violence, as well as somebody who continued to mix in those former elites. And I also found out, quite important as well, evidence to demonstrate that my grandparents actually were leaving because they were afraid of being prosecuted, not just they were leaving for the sun and a bit more land, which is what I was told. So an important piece of information was that they, soon after the capture of Eichmann, they actually put their property on the market for a fraction of the price that it was worth. And you have to remember that this property was prime property west of Hamburg. It was land with forest and a very fancy mansion on it, which served as a hotel. So it wasn't just some sort of shack. And he wanted just to get rid of it as quickly as he could. And this raised suspicions among the townspeople. Why was it that they? Well, of course they knew. They seemed to know why he was dropping everything and leaving at that time. So that's what was in there. And your other question was about, sorry, if you just give me a quick reminder.
Oh, yeah.
What it was.
People mentioned he was a good farmer. And the reason that stuck out to me is I'm from Iowa. I have farm family on both sides.
Yeah.
In the mid-20th century, to refer to a man as a good farmer in a semi-rural or small town environment is just about the highest praise that you can give someone. Yeah. That's not thrown out flippantly. So I was surprised to see that.
Yeah. Well, I was surprised about it too. Actually, that was something that one of the people who was a descendant of somebody who worked on my grandfather's estates in Poland, in occupied Poland, was actually what one of those people came up with, that he was a good farmer. Yes, it was high praise, but at the same time, I think you have to put it in context. I arrived there probably looking very ashamed and guilt-ridden and bewildered, because I had also come from several other meetings with people who had described, just stomach churning violence toward the